Welcome to Motley Fool Conversations. I'm your host, Motley Fool contributor Rich Lamello, along with Motley Fool Head of Strategic Operations Shannon Jones. Today's guest is someone who sits at the crossroads of business consulting, advertising, and technology, and has spent his career helping some of the world's most influential brands understand how people really think and make decisions. Michael Aaron Flicker is the author of the compelling new book, Hacking the Human Mind. He's worked with companies ranging from Nike and Chubb to Evan Williams, JP Morgan, and AstraZeneca. His work zeroes in on the psychological forces that shape markets, shape brands, and ultimately shape investor behavior. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the Motley Fool.
Hi, Rich. Thanks for having me. Excited to be with you all today.
Oh, excellent. Well, Michael, for listeners who may not, kind of know you or be familiar with your work yet, what's kind of the short version of your professional journey? A little bit of background.
I started my company when I was 14 years old in my parents' basement, and it was a time in 1997 when the world believed that the internet was a great equalizing force, and maybe high school kids knew more about the internet than anybody else. And in that moment of opportunity, the kid I grew up with across the street and I formed our company, and we said we're going to do internet programming. We're going to do computer programming on the internet. And that was really innovative at the time, almost silly. Real computer programming, Rich, belonged in the domain of mainframes and big corporations. And the idea that anybody could do meaningful computer programming online was just unusual at the time, and just crazy enough that they let a bunch of high school kids work for these big companies. And the story of the last 28 years for me has always been at the intersection of thinking about how can we come up with smart ideas to solve problems? How can we solve things that others haven't been able to solve before? It's led me now to, I own 9 companies. We have a number of them in our professional services, a number of them of our own brands. But what connects them all, and what's been so interesting, is that behavioral science has been a key to understanding why people do what they do and to really understand how they act in the real world. So much of what we learned in our years was you would run these studies and ask consumers, would you be open to buying this brand? Or would you be open to taking this medication? And when you ask them that, they give you an answer. Then you go into market and they do the exact opposite. How could that be that people don't follow what it is they say they're going to do? And so academia has built this body of research and academics that helps explain how consumers actually behave rather than how they claim they will behave. And this was a fascinating field for me. I got involved in it about 12, 13 years ago, and it's been a passion of mine ever since.
Got it. And would you say as a result of that that idea, that theme, that question is that which kind of ties your work together?
Without doubt, if you want to be successful in business-to-business communications, or if you want to be successful in business-to-consumer, brand-to-consumer communications, either way, you have to find a way to make an impact with people, make a connection, and motivate some type of action. And so in any of the 9 businesses that I have, the question always comes down to, how do we get consumers or people to do something that they weren't otherwise previously thinking about doing, to act a different way? And behavioral science gives us a little bit of an edge, a little bit of an unfair advantage to nudge people in the direction that we think it would be good for them to go.
Sure. Shannon, obviously I defer here.
Yeah, I would love to hop in because in my role in strategic operations, I'm really at the intersection of our product teams and also work really closely with our CEO, who is a wonderful visionary, lots of ideas, but he's super passionate for our members, especially as they go through market cycles, market downturns, and everything, to really realize this is a long-term investing journey, and to really ride the waves of those journeys, knowing that the market cycles come and go. You'll have good days, you'll have bad days, and it really is about staying the course. I'd love to get your take. How does, I think, the emotional reframing in your mind empower people to take like braver actions to stay the course, especially when it comes to finances or really in anything as it relates to investing? Like, how do you connect the dots there?
when I was growing up and learning my first economics classes, my first business classes, we learned these models that humans are rational actors. And given the choice of one good option and one bad option, they're going to choose the good option. And the challenge in my career and in my life has been that's not always proven to be the case. They don't always choose the thing that's in their best interest. They don't always choose the thing that seems like the best option for them. And I think one thing that all the listeners can think about is humans are much more emotionally driven than rationally driven. Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman said, thinking is to humans like swimming is to cats. They can do it, they just prefer not to. And so there's something about the human experience that if we can take a mental shortcut, if we can not have to work as hard to get to that outcome, we're not going to. Fascinating fact, the human brain is only 2% weight of your whole body, but consumes 20% of all your calories. So literally over hundreds of thousands of years, the development of humans has been a survival of the fittest to use as few calories as possible. And we're going to use these mental powers we have to make these shortcuts. So your question, Shannon, is how do we teach people to stay the course? How do we teach them to invest in the long game rather than the short game? The first thing is to understand that the rational, logical argument may not be the most compelling one. It may be the one that the data shows you to take, but there might be a lot more going on behind the scenes. So when you think about investing, we want to reveal these behavioral science insights, these psychological tricks to help people analyze brands, businesses that they might invest in, but also analyze their own motivations and their own actions to better understand what might be at play. Because the more that you understand how the human mind works, the more you can work with it rather than against it. The more you work with it, the more effective you're going to be.
I love that. I would love to keep going along those same lines. You explain in your book, Hacking the Human Mind, which I love that title, by the way. Got a lot of looks at Thanksgiving from my in-laws walking around with that book, by the way. But you explain in the book that loss aversion is really one of the strongest forces in human behavior. You use the Got Milk campaign just to show how powerful that is. The ad didn't sell milk's benefits. It was really the fear of running out. And at the Motley Fool, obviously, we see loss aversion every time members will panic sell or freeze during those downturns. So my question is, why is loss aversion so dominant, and how can companies like ours really help people make better long-term decisions without really exploiting that fear at the same time?
Absolutely. So first of all, the definition by the social scientists would say loss aversion is the tendency to feel the pain of losses more intensely than the pleasure of equivalent gains. And that can lead, as you're saying, to losing investments for too long or being too risk averse on new opportunities because of that fear of loss. So the academic study that backs this up is actually fascinating. So let's start there, and then we can talk a little bit about the impacts. Israeli psychologist Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, it's 1979, and they think up this experiment. What if we offer people a bet on a coin flip? Tails, they lose, and they have to give us $10. Heads, they win, and they win $10. The researchers wanted to know the amount people would need to be offered before that win was worth the loss bet. How much would they have to get paid in order to be worth a $10 loss? And the key finding was that most people wouldn't gamble unless they were set to win at least $20, meaning they'd rather not risk losing 10 unless the potential reward was double that, $20. And other studies have shown similar real world situations and outcomes. So what we learned from that is it's human nature to want to hold on to things more than they want to gain new things. And that psychological barrier of being afraid of losing something really has an outsized impact on our actions. So Shannon, you mentioned the Got Milk example. the book goes through great brands and how they've taken advantage of psychological insights into how we act and how that's led to good business outcomes for them. So Got Milk could have very easily said, think about how amazing Oreos would be and Chips Ahoy's would be with milk. But they don't say that. What they say is, how bad would those Chips Ahoy's and Oreos be without a delicious glass of milk with it? And that fear of not having it is a much stronger sensation. And that's what drives people to act because of loss aversion.
If I can follow up, so from kind of a psychological standpoint, do you think that that is the bias that investors underestimate the most, that fear of loss?
I think there's probably two major psychological impacts that are driving investor decisions as a marketer. One, I would say, is loss aversion, without doubt, Rich.
Sure.
The second is this concept called the sunk cost fallacy. And it's really an interesting insight. So let's pair it with loss aversion. So loss aversion says the pain of losing is more intense than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. In fact, I need to have twice as much gain to be worth the risk of that loss. So that's loss aversion. Sunk cost fallacy is this idea that humans have a tendency to continue investing simply because they've already done that before. And we call it the sunk cost fallacy because it's not necessarily rational. It's not necessarily logical. And so because I have an inclination to match my past behavior, if I've already started investing in one type of investment, I want to continue to see that through. I've already started down that path. I want to see how it does. I've already made a $100 investment. Even if it loses a little, I've already got my $100 in. I want to see what it does. That fallacy that just because I've put something in, I have a first sunk cost, drives a lot of future actions. And there's actually some fascinating academic studies on this. There's a lot to choose from. I'll just pick one that's really interesting. This is a study from 1985. It's Arks and Blummer, and they give a thought experiment to a group of people. Let's say on one hand, you're looking for a ski trip for your family, and you go and you buy a $100 ticket to a Wisconsin ski weekend, and you're set, you're excited, and that's going to be a very good ski weekend. And then you, a few weeks later, buy a $50 ticket to Michigan to a great ski weekend. That's going to be an even more enjoyable ski weekend. And then, oh no, you realize that they're both on the same weekend, and you have to make a choice. Should you go with the average $100 ski weekend or the much better $50 ski weekend? 54% of people choose the less enjoyable trip just because they had spent more on it. So because you want to be consistent with your past behavior, even though you know you're going to like it less, you choose the more expensive option. And that's just not logical. It's just not rational. And so it really challenges us to think, are we being more emotionally driven in our actions, or are we truly being more academically, logically focused? And being able to spot those things when they're happening can make us smarter investors. They can make us smarter humans.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to pick up on that, I think in the book you actually use Amazon as a great example with sunk cost fallacy in their Prime subscription model. And obviously they've done quite well with that model. I'm a huge Prime subscriber myself, Amazon shareholder, like many of our members are. But taking that hat off and putting on my strategic operations hat and working across product and working with our marketing team here, I'm often thinking about, and we're always talking about with our subscriptions, with our products, how we price them, and how do we make sure we really get, and our members feel like they get value out of that. I think you also bring out in the book, Amazon even has, I think it's called charm pricing, where it's like $9.99. What do those examples teach us, or what can they teach us here at the Motley Fool about how people perceive value, and how can companies like ours use pricing psychology ethically?
So picking up on that thread, Shannon, of the idea that you're going to want to be consistent with your past behavior. Once you become an Amazon Prime member, once you join any of these membership services, you're more likely to want to invest and use those services rather than be a switcher. One study shows that Prime members spend $110 a month on their Prime buying versus just $38 a month of non-Prime members on their shopping on Amazon. So there's a lot more bulk buying when you already have invested in the service or in the membership. And it's beyond Amazon. You see Uber has their Uber One product, $9.99 for $0 delivery fees. Or famously Pret, which is a chain of sandwich and coffee shops in London and New York. They offer a plan, $5 a month to get up to 5 half-priced coffees. Now, if you're already a Pret member and you've given them that $5 each month, and then you walking down the road, you're much more likely to skip the Starbucks, skip the Costa Coffee, and walk the extra 100 feet to go to Pret, which isn't necessarily logical, but it's because you want to be consistent with that membership that you've already gotten. So lots of brands have now tapped into this. It's why subscription pricing is so prevalent. But what's really an interesting factor of subscription pricing that a lot of people don't talk about is, would it be better to charge them once a year for $139, that's the going rate of Amazon Prime, or is it better to charge them $9.99 every month? And fascinating, a number of studies reveal that the pain of payment every month helps reinforce that consistent behavior and improves your chance of using the product because you're reminding yourself through your credit card statement that this is the type of buyer I am. I'm an Amazon Prime member. I'm a gym subscription member, and my gym bills me every month. I better get back to the gym this month. So sometimes you want to reduce the pain of payment. You do not want people to feel the size of that spend. And other times, like in this bias, a little bit of reminding them the payment may help them use your product more frequently and more often. So that's really some of the big insights around how we use the sunk cost fallacy to get people to come back. Probably one of the most interesting studies that double underscores this point is another study from Arks and Blummer, but this time they're studying theater goers. And so they line up, I think it's the University of Ohio, and they go to the campus theater. And they have people lining up to buy their season tickets for all the shows that the university is going to show. And so they randomly divide up people that are coming up to the window. Some people are charged $15, full price for the tickets to the university shows. Some are charged $13, slight discount. And some are charged only $8 a ticket at deep discount. What's fascinating, they track the attendance at all the shows. Those who pay full price attended 25% more shows than those that got the discounted, the deep discounted price. So those that were invested, who paid the full amount of money, were more motivated to get their money's worth out of their subscription. So fascinating to think about how when we sell things at discount, when brands go on sale, they might be driving up revenue in the moment, but they actually might be devaluing the experience with customers, and they may have less coming back. So it's always a balancing act. How do we position our brand and our products to really improve people's perception? And then in some places, how do we not send the wrong signal and get less usage and less repeat buyers? So sunk cost fallacy works in a number of different ways.
And are there signs, in your experience, are there signs that a particular company has a strong grasp of customer psychology? You know, when you go into work with somebody, do you kind of sit there and go, okay, these guys get it, or no?
I think it's so right the way you phrase the question, Rich, because a lot of times in business, you will find a rare individual in the organization that just seems to get human psychology more than others. They just have a sense of what's going to activate the customer or what's going to activate the buyer. But a lot of times, they're either a great strategist or they're a great creative person, and they use that to make a promotion work or make a sale work or make a product work, but they don't know why. They have the insight, they have the reason to believe in this, but they're not really sure what's driving it. So the practice of behavioral science, the reason I wrote the book, was so that we can reveal these and understand the underlying reasons why this exists. So this is a fascinating, one of my favorite stories in all of behavioral science, and it's called the Prattfall effect. And so this is a study in the 1960s. They record someone answering a live quiz. And so he gets asked a question and he responds, asks a question, he responds. He scores 93% correct. And then right before the recording ends, he spills his coffee on himself. Okay, so now they have this recording and they show it to two separate groups. One group of people are asked to watch the recording with the spill included and rate how likable the contestant was in answering the question. And then the second group is shown the same exact video, except they clip off the end where he has a small blunder, what we call a small pratfall, where he spills on himself. How likable is the contestant in both scenarios? People rated the contestant 55% more likable when he has a small blunder, when he spills the coffee on himself. Now, that's not logical. Why? The same questions, the same answers, 55% more likable. And so it drives home this point that brands who can think about how to use these human insights can really make a difference. Who's taking great advantage of that pratfall insight? Think about a great line by Guinness Beer. Good things come to those who wait. That's a nod to when you order a Guinness at the bar, you have to wait longer than everybody else to get your beer because the head of the stout is coming down and the bartender has to refill it. Or famously in the 1960s, Avis said, "We're number 2. We have to try harder," when they were competing against Hertz. They admit their flaw, and because of that, they become more likable, more believable. Listerine has a great one. The taste you hate twice a day, meaning it's so astringent, it must be working. They're accepting the flaw that Listerine is hard to gargle for 30 seconds. And in doing that, they're proving a mirror strength, which is that it must be very effective. So did Listerine, Avis, Guinness Beer know the pratfall effect? Probably not. In fact, the Avis ads came out 7 years before this study that I'm talking about was ever run. But the people who made the Avis had that insight into humanity that they took advantage of. So as investors, we can be looking at where brands do this, where they either through their product or their service meet a psychological need of consumers. That's a great one to look for. Nir Eyal in his book Hooked talks about any brand that meets a psychological need is going to be more successful than others. Or in these examples, where a brand is using a communication, a marketing, advertising that seems to get the human instinct in a way that others may not realize, and that's a really great thing to look for as investors, to think about what brands may be ahead of the curve. I don't think it's a leading indicator, but I think it's a pretty good bet that if they're doing that and doing it well, they can be really successful.
So I have to ask the $1,000,000 question then, Michael Aaron. In the age of AI, when it comes to human flaws, likability, humanity, I mean, who wins in this case? Is it the brands that are out there showing their humanity, or is it really AI is just going to level the playing field? Where does this all shake out?
You know, we're talking at such an interesting time. We're recording the show right after Black Friday, Cyber Monday. I saw a Reuters report this morning that said $3 billion of Black Friday spending was influenced by AI assistants or AI agents, meaning you go to Amazon, you ask Rufus, what's the best deodorant, and now comes out a lot of options. AI is guiding you to your choice. The game is changing quick. And those brands that have a strategy to be optimized for AI search, we used to call it, Shannon and Rich, SEO, search engine optimized. We now have a whole field called AIO, artificial intelligence optimized, so that your brands and products are recommended by AI agents when it comes time for that. But let's say that's on the bleeding edge. Let's say that that's the very small percent, but a good leading indicator of where we're going. Today, most buying decisions are still made by humans. And insofar as the buying decisions are being made by humans, we are susceptible to our natural human instincts. So brands and businesses that understand those human insights, those psychological biases, are going to be more likely to get people to buy their products and buy them more often. So insofar as we are listening to this podcast in 2026, I feel real good that we are having people make their buying decisions for the most part, and these human biases are at play. Once we have AI agents and others really giving us a wildly curated down set of options, or maybe saying this is the best compression sock money can buy, how much decision making are we doing as buyers? And that's a very exciting and interesting place for brands to grow into.
Yeah, it's funny. Shannon asked a question that was like on the top of my mind, looking at algorithms. If my wife is talking to one of my kids about a pair of shoes, all of a sudden, and everybody's got stories like this, all of a sudden an ad pops up on my phone and I'm like, okay, this is, and so are there ethical lines where these companies, you've got these modern marketing tools and everybody's got an algorithm story where all of a sudden something's popping up? Is there a responsibility for business leaders when they're, kind of using these psychological insights? Are there ethical lines being crossed?
I think it's a big, important topic in our field because, first of all, as businesses, we want to be making products that are good for people and good for the community and good for our countries. And what behavioral science really does is it shines a light on how much of our decision-making process is system two thinking, subconscious, emotional, not logical and rational. One study shows only 5% of decisions are really logical and rational based, 95% are more emotionally based, more subconscious. So what behavioral science as a field of study and as those of us, I'm not a behavioral scientist, I apply them. I apply behavioral science principles to the real world. We have a real ethical mandate to do it in a way that is both ethical and responsible for our clients. So here's the shorthand principle we have developed and what I recommend to all of our clients, and we call it the publicity principle. How would you feel if everyone who just bought from you knew exactly what the biases you were exploiting were using? And if you're feeling a little shamed right now, if you're feeling like you took a little advantage, that's a pretty good sign you may have crossed some level of an ethical line. And it's amazing how much of a barometer that is to decide what companies ought to do and not do. I think it's totally appropriate to understand that folks have a left-hand digit bias. And if you say $49.99, that is 1 penny less than 50, but it gets a lot more equated to being in the 40s rather than being in the 50s, and taking advantage of that drives more people to buy your product for 1 penny less than they otherwise would. That's okay. And I think if people heard that, they would say, sure. I mean, that's it's on me to be more logical if I'm going to make a decision. But if you use a principle that makes people feel ashamed of themselves or uses fear to alter action, you're probably in a space where you don't want to be. And yeah, these are evolutionary traits that have developed in us over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. So it's upon us to then know about them and then use them ethically and responsibly.
Yeah. And on the topic of, using these things ethically and responsibly, in the book you mentioned Klarna. It's a company we've recommended. A lot of our members have invested in as well. And it's really, I think, a fascinating example of how a brand has reframed an entire mental model. Klarna didn't just offer installment payments. They really turned it into something playful almost. Very low friction, emotionally light, buy now, pay later experience. their language, their style, even the micro copy, very small print language, all designed to really reduce the psychological pain of spending. Now, some people on one side of the coin would say, I think they've crossed a line with that. They're pushing the boundary. Others will say, actually, no, they've just made it easier for people to buy something they would have otherwise. And they've just opened the door for people who maybe don't have the funds right now, but like they've just created an easier opportunity. What does Klarna teach us, both as consumers but also as investors, about some of those emotional and linguistic shifts that can dramatically change consumer behaviors?
I think we have two really interesting stories that come from Klarna. And the first is actually has nothing to do with investing and nothing to do with behavioral science. It has to do with how they started the company. These are two university students who have this idea in Stockholm that, you know what, we have a culture that doesn't use a lot of credit cards. Is there a way for us to get pay over time, payments done? And they actually enter a competition where the King of Sweden is one of the judges. And when they do this contest and they do the announcement and they pitch their almost in like a Shark Tank style concept of what their business is, they come in nearly last place. And all the judges had the same reaction. If this was a good idea, why wouldn't the big banks have done it? If this wasn't a good idea, why wouldn't the financial institutions already have done it? Like, this can't work. And I always take away this entrepreneurial grit story. These two young guys, one of them took a job at Burger King while they were trying to get the company Klarna started, just to have enough cash to get through those early startup days. They really showed that if they had a right consumer insight and they did it the right way, it can be a big hit. So obviously, I think there's just a really great entrepreneurial story. And then I think the other thing that many people don't realize about one of Klarna's most popular options is they're playing with this concept of temporal reframing. It's also commonly known as the pennies a day effect. And the original study teaches us a lot. It comes from Harvard University, 1998. There's 120 participants, and they are shown one of 6 hypothetical charities that they can make a donation to. And the requests were presented either as a daily figure, give $1 a day for a year, or an annual figure, almost equivalent, give $350 over the one-time payment for the whole year. And the findings were clear. Participants were 53% more likely to agree to $1 a day request than making that big pain of payment of $350 all at once, even though that $350 is $15 less than the pennies a day effect, right? Than what would otherwise be $1 a day times 365 days. And so, it becomes a psychological question. Why do you take an objectively worse offer, $15 worse in this example, just so that you could pay it $1 a day? And the most likely explanation is that people consider the specific amount being sought and imagine what they could do with that amount of money. So when you have $1, you think, well, I could buy a can of soda. But if you think of something larger, they do the math, they can think of 365 cans. And so that question becomes whether helping whatever that donation is, what's that amount of money? And when you think of $350, well, that could be a winter coat. That could be a nice night at a hotel. $350 looks like a lot more. And so, people are not just thinking about what's the charity and is it worth $1 a day or $350. They're thinking, what's that dollar buy me right now? And how does that affect me? And $1 a day is much easier to part with than $350 right now, even though it would be a better financial choice to make.
Great. Well, I've got one final question for you, and then I'll kick it back over to Rich. But putting my strategic ops hat back on here, if every employee here at the Motley Fool adopted just one principle from Hacking the Mind tomorrow, what principle would create the biggest transformation across our culture, our products and the members we serve.
This comes from maybe one of the most startling realizations that I had as I was researching the book and writing the book. And it almost sounds so simple. I'm going to take a little time to explain it because it didn't make sense to me when I first uncovered it. And this is this idea that the power of a single word can have a dramatic effect on the final decision people make. So the story that we use in the book is from 1970, the late 1970s, and our hero of the story is this gentleman, Lee Lance, and he's an American fish importer. And he has discovered a fish in South America that he believes is just going to rock the American market. It's going to be amazing. And he takes it from restaurant to restaurant, and nobody buys it. He can't figure out, like, why is this fish not selling? And then he comes up with the idea, maybe it's the name of the fish. Patagonian toothfish wasn't very appealing. He rebrands it Chilean sea bass. And in the 1990s, it saw a 30-fold increase in consumption in that decade alone. And that feels like a one-off. The fish industry actually gives us tons of these examples. It was called dolphin fish for so long. For me, it conjures up Flipper, everybody's favorite dolphin. Rebranded as mahi mahi, and now it sounds great in tacos. Or how about mudbug linguine? It was called that for years. Rebranded crawfish linguine, and now it's selling like crazy. And, you know, it's not just fish. Frank Luntz, famous political pollster here in the United States, he says, you know, you called it an inheritance tax, and 68% of the people oppose it. But label it the estate tax, label it the death tax, and now that number jumps up to 78%. So just the name that you use to describe something can dramatically change how people feel. And if that feels a little bit like conjecture, here's the study that proves this inside out. It's 1974 at the University of Washington, and they bring a group of participants in and they show them the exact same clip of a car crash. And it's exactly what you're thinking in your mind. The car is hurtling towards a wall, it hits the wall, and up comes the airbags. And so the challenge in the experiment is to estimate how fast the car is moving. Everybody sees the same clip. How fast is the car moving? Except, here's the twist in the experiment. Sometimes they say, how fast was the car moving when it contacted the wall? Sometimes they say, how fast was the car moving when it hit the wall, bumped the wall, collided with the wall, or smashed into the wall? They only changed the verb. In this instance, those that were asked how fast the car was going when it smashed the wall thought it was traveling 27% faster than those that were asked how fast was the car going when it contacted the wall. One word can change 27% the outcome that people think they see in the video. And that's a life lesson for all of us, especially as marketers, as brand owners, as CEOs, as executives in businesses. When we know our categories so well, we're so certain that the words we're using everyone can understand. But buyers and investors might be light users of your product. They may be uninitiated into your space, and just one word could totally change the way they receive your information. And so we want to be aware of that, and we want to be thinking about that. And so if everybody at Motley Fool took that back with them, we could be more thoughtful about how our words are received rather than what we wanted to say. I think we would all be more effective communicators.
When you begin work with a major brand, you know, I mentioned at the top, you know, Nike, JP Morgan, is there like a psychological principle that you're looking for? And also the elite brands that you've worked with, which are, you know, many, is there something that, you know, kind of distinguishes them, like their understanding of human behavior? Any commonalities stand out?
When we meet with brands, the first thing we're looking for is what do they perceive as their largest problems, their biggest barriers. And when you hear people describe them, they often will describe the larger picture and what's happening And our job is to listen for where is there not maybe just a product quality problem, maybe not just a usability problem, the website's not easy to work through, but where might there be something, a gap in meeting a psychological need. So we're always listening for where could the product or the service meet that bigger need. And a lot of times it's about framing that consumers and buyers are more emotional than they are rational. And that helps us uncover where there's bigger psychological places to play, bigger ability to push our competitors aside, and have more of a unique spot in the mindset of the buyer. But the thing that has been the defining factor of brands that have taken these ideas and done the most with them actually has nothing to do with their size. It has to do with their culture of being willing to test. Behavioral science is a collection of insights into human action, into human behavior. But it's not a guarantee that it's going to get somebody who was a smoker for 20 years to stop smoking tomorrow. Our job is to test these interventions, test these things, and see what's working and then run with that. So a culture that has a testing mindset, a culture that's willing to test and have the answer, either we win or we learn, those are the cultures where we have seen the most impact, because you have a continually iterative process to find the best outcomes for brands. So the thing I always tell leaders when we first start, usually it's the C-suite, we sit down, we have a big learning meeting, and we talk about the most important items. And what we always say to them is, we want to celebrate putting things in market and seeing what happens, because it's through that iterative process we're going to get to the best outcomes, we're going to learn the most, and we're going to get to the best endings for these brands. And those that embrace that, we have a lot of success. Those where that corporate culture can't support that, we see a lot more friction. Is that a fair way to say it, Rich and Shannon? We see a lot more friction in the process.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And this is a tough one. Because, you got to get the crystal ball out, but, and we've already talked about, kind of AI and just, kind of the seismic shifts that's bringing to, to everything. But are there shifts in human behavior that you expect to see, I don't know, next 5 years, next decade, that investors should be preparing for? Or is it just that? Is it AI and all of that means?
What's so interesting about being deep in the academics of behavioral science is studies that were ran 100 years ago still basically hold true today. We can rerun an experiment from 1936 and the results in 2024 are almost identical. I think that what that reveals is that the modern world has changed much faster around us than our brains have been able to adapt to it. So our brains are still evolved for a pre-industrial revolution mindset. When we see big blocks of colors, we pay attention. We have a great example of pareidolia, which is the phenomenon that folks will see faces if there's even the lightest hint of a smile and two eyes. Kraft famously uses this on their box of macaroni and cheese to interrupt you when you're walking down the aisle, because you notice that it looks like the elbow is making a smile looking at you. Very famously studied case. So I think human behavior is less likely to change in the next 5 or 10 years at a pace that investors could get an edge. But what is likely to change, a mission I'm on, is to educate businesses of how to better use these insights and these biases to be more effective in communication. One thing we've seen in the last 20 years, the number of media channels, the amount of time spent on social media, the amount of clutter for a brand to reach a buyer with a product has never been more fragmented, never been more complex. So using these behavioral insights gives brands an edge over their competitors. So smart brands that use this have a better chance of winning in the market. And so I'd encourage all investors to say, not just how superior is the product, not just how much white space do they have amongst their competitors, but how well do they activate against buyers' emotional needs? How well do they understand the psychology of their buyer in order to be successful in the market. Because at the end of the day, we all know the best products in the world that don't have the right marketing, that don't meet the consumer at the right moment, never take off. And so we want to have more brands use these techniques to have better effect.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Michael Aaron Flicker, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for coming on Motley Fool Conversations. The book is Hacking the Human Mind by Michael Aaron Flicker and Richard Schotten. Thank you so much for your time. On behalf of Shannon Jones, I'm Rich Lamello. Thank you for listening to Motley Fool Conversations.